rain hadn't stopped for hours. It was the kind of heavy, stubborn drizzle that felt almost deliberate, as if the sky itself were mourning the man they had all come to bury. David Montgomery stood in the grand hallway of the Montgomery estate, his suit soaked at the cuffs, his hair still damp from the walk up the long circular drive. The house hadn't changed since childhood. Tall ceilings, oil portraits of grim ancestors, the scent of old wood tobacco, and leather-bound silence. He hadn't been here in 7 years, not since the fight. The lawyer, Mr. Crane, was already waiting in the library. So were the others, his half-sister Meredith, her husband Blake, Aunt Elaine from Arizona, and Richard, his father's longtime advisor, who seemed to be everywhere, yet belonged to nothing. David sat quietly, his eyes on the heavy mahogany table. No one spoke. Even the fire crackled with restraint. Mr. Crane cleared his throat. "This will be brief," he said, opening the folder with the kind of finality that only death allows. David felt his heartbeat slow. This was it. The inheritance. The empire. The redemption, maybe. For everything. The distance, the arguments, the silence between him and his father. He was the firstborn. The only biological son. Mr. Crane read the will aloud. To Meredith, the Palm Beach property and a trust. To Aunt Elaine, a lifetime stipend and the Wyoming land. To Richard, the entirety of Montgomery Holdings, the chain of hotels, the real estate, the shares, the power. David waited. His name hadn't been spoken yet. Surely there was more. Mr. Crane paused. "And to my son David Montgomery." The room went still. David sat taller. "I leave nothing. A beat. I do this not out of anger but clarity. He is strong enough without it." That was all. The silence after was louder than the storm outside. David didn't move. No one looked at him. Richard coughed. Aunt Elaine blinked 3 times slowly. Meredith's eyes flicked to the floor. Mr. Crane closed the file. "That concludes the reading." David stood. His hands were cold, numb even. There was no speech, no anger, no scene. He simply turned and walked out of the room. Outside, the rain welcomed him back like an old friend. He drove aimlessly for hours, the city lights blurring against the windshield. He didn't cry, he didn't scream. What he felt was harder to name. It wasn't betrayal. It was erasure. To be acknowledged only to be disowned in front of witnesses. His father had died a billionaire. David now had less than $3,000 in his checking account, no apartment and no plan. He had left his job 2 weeks ago, confident that the will would give him space to figure things out. He laughed bitterly. How ironic. A red light stopped him downtown. The kind of intersection that splits cities. One street leads to everything glossy and sharp, the other to everything broken and forgotten. He stared at the rain, at the reflection of his face in the windshield, and he wondered what his father saw when he wrote those words. He is strong enough without it. What kind of strength did he think David had? What did he mean? Later that night, with nowhere else to go, David returned to the estate. The security guard didn't stop him. Maybe he recognized him, maybe he didn't care. The house was quiet now. The others had gone, taking their fortunes with them. David wandered the empty halls. The place felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by decisions. He stood in the study, his father's favorite room. The walls lined with first editions, the smell of cedar and old cigars. The chair still indented from a man who would never sit again. And there in the bottom drawer of the desk he found it. A box, locked, small enough to be personal, old enough to feel sacred. He found the key taped under the drawer, the kind of detail only someone who grew up here would think to check. The lock clicked open. Inside were letters, dozens, all addressed to him, some sealed, some crumpled, all written in the same clean, elegant handwriting. They weren't dated, but the first line of the top letter said, "If you're reading this, it means I left you nothing." David sat down, his hands trembling. He read, "If you're reading this, it means I left you nothing." The sentence lingered like smoke in David's mind. He read the rest of the letter in silence, the words slow, deliberate. His father's voice returned in fragments, that low, reserved tone that always seemed too controlled to be sincere. "It wasn't because I stopped loving you. It was because I finally started understanding myself and what I had done to you." David blinked. "What?" "I gave you everything when you were a boy, except the one thing I never had, distance. A chance to see the world without my shadow." Each letter unraveled another layer of his father's guilt. There were apologies, half-formed confessions, reflections on power, regret, inheritance, and the legacy of control. One letter ended with, "I raised you like an heir, not a son. I'm sorry." Another, "If I had given you the empire, I would have destroyed you just like it destroyed me." David read until the morning light began to touch the edges of the windows. He hadn't slept. He didn't notice the cold. Something was shifting inside him. For the first time in years, he felt quiet. 3 days later, David checked into a small motel outside Chicago. No one recognized the Montgomery name there. No one cared, and for the first time he liked that. He had no plans, no direction, but he had something unfamiliar. Space. No pressure to perform, no expectations to carry, no empire to protect. The first few nights were restless. He dreamt of the mansion, of being chased through its halls, of doors slamming shut just as he reached for them. But each morning he woke up less bitter. The taste of resentment faded, replaced by a question: who was I before all of this? David took a job washing dishes at a diner. Not out of necessity, he still had some savings, but because he needed movement, something real. Something that didn't involve legacy trust funds or last names printed on buildings. At first he worked in silence, avoided eye contact, but over time the rhythm of the place soothed him. He started listening, laughing, talking. One night a waitress named Carla sat next to him on break and asked, "What'd you do before this?" He hesitated, then said, "I was supposed to inherit everything, but I didn't." She looked at him. "Lucky you." He smiled, not out of politeness, but agreement. Back at the Montgomery estate, things were unraveling. Richard, the man who had inherited everything, was in the news. Allegations of fraud, investors pulling out, internal lawsuits. David saw it by accident, a headline on a news app at the bus stop. Montgomery Holdings faces collapse amidst leadership scandal. He stared at the screen unmoved. Part of him expected to feel vindicated, maybe even joyful. But what he felt was deeper. A quiet affirmation that his father had been right. The empire was never meant to be saved, only escaped. Weeks turned to months. David found a studio apartment, painted the walls himself, bought a second-hand couch, read more of the letters, slowly, one at a time, like conversations with a man who never learned how to speak while alive. One letter struck him harder than the rest. "You were always looking for my approval. I never knew how to give it. So I left you this instead, a clean slate." He folded the letter carefully, placed it in a small box under his bed. Late one evening, David stood in the alley behind the diner, smoking a cigarette he didn't finish. He looked up at the moon, pale and distant, and for the first time since that rainy day in the mansion, he whispered aloud, "Thank you." Not to anyone in particular, maybe to his father, maybe to himself, because somehow having nothing had given him everything. Not wealth, but weightlessness. 2 months after the funeral, David returned to the Montgomery estate. Not because he wanted to claim anything. There was nothing left to claim. He returned because something inside him needed to see it again. The place where everything ended and maybe where something else began. The gates were open. The mansion, though guarded by legal restrictions and fading prestige, felt abandoned. It wasn't empty, not exactly. Staff still tended to the grounds, some executives probably still pretended things were fine, but the house itself felt hollow. It was as if the soul had leaked out. David walked the long stone path alone. No one stopped him. He stepped into the main foyer and felt the same cold he had felt as a boy, a kind of curated silence designed more for intimidation than comfort. The chandelier still hung above like a golden threat. The portraits on the walls still stared with judgment. But something had shifted. They no longer had power over him. He walked past the library, the dining room, the hall of mirrors. Every creak in the floor echoed louder than it should. Every shadow seemed to carry a memory. The place was less haunted by ghosts and more by choices. In the east wing he entered his old bedroom. It had been untouched. The furniture still arranged like it was waiting for him to return. A trophy case, empty. A photo on the dresser. Him and his father at a baseball game, neither of them smiling. He sat on the edge of the bed and exhaled slowly. How many years had he wanted to be seen in this house, heard, loved? And now, sitting in the very space that had once made him feel invisible, he felt peace. Because now he saw clearly. The house wasn't power. It was a monument to pain. Drawn by some invisible thread, he made his way back to the study, the place where he had found the letters. He didn't expect to find anything else. But when he opened the middle drawer, he saw something strange. The wood panel at the back wasn't aligned. Gently he pressed it, and it slid open, revealing a narrow, hidden compartment. Inside, a single key and a sealed envelope with his name in thick, deliberate ink. He opened it with shaking hands. The handwriting was familiar. "This key opens the wine cellar below the west wing. I never showed it to you because it wasn't meant to be part of your inheritance. But now, it's yours if you choose to open it. No signature. Just that. A choice." The door to the cellar was hidden behind a bookshelf tucked into the oldest part of the mansion, a section built before electricity, before comfort. It smelled of dust, old stone, and wine long forgotten. David unlocked the door. It creaked open like a sigh held for decades. He descended the stairs slowly, one hand on the wall. The air was colder here. Still, at the bottom the light from above barely touched the ground. But there in the center of the cellar was a small wooden chest. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in cloth, were artifacts. Not wealth, not gold or documents or jewelry. Photos, letters, journals, his mother's handwriting, his baby shoes, his first drawing, a dried flower, memories, pieces of a life his father had never acknowledged. He fell to his knees. For all the silence, for all the distance, for all the control. His father had saved this, not for display, not for legacy, but for him. The final letter in the chest was dated 1 week before his death. "David, I couldn't tell you everything. I didn't know how. But I kept this to remind myself that you were more than an heir. You were my son. I hope you find peace in the life I couldn't give you. Love, always, in my broken way, Dad." David sat there for a long time, the letter in his hands, surrounded by the only things that ever really mattered. In the quiet of the cellar, for the first time since childhood, he wept. The next morning, David sat cross-legged on the floor of his motel room. The wooden chest, the one from the cellar, lay open beside him. The photos, the baby shoes, the dried flower, all carefully arranged like fragments of a language he was finally starting to understand. But it was the journals that called to him most. His father had kept them in leather-bound notebooks, nearly a dozen of them, their pages yellowed and soft from age. No dates, no titles. Just thoughts. Private confessions, observations, and emotions never voiced. David turned the first page. "I don't know how to love in the way people expect. I only know how to provide." He paused. Every time I tried to speak to David, something stopped me. Fear? Pride? Maybe the belief that fathers aren't supposed to apologize. Each page unraveled another invisible thread that had stretched and snapped between them. There were memories David had forgotten. Moments so small and subtle, he didn't realize they were being remembered from the other side. He was 6 when he asked me why I never hugged him. I told him I didn't want to spoil him. That was a lie. I didn't know how. David felt a tightness in his chest that he hadn't noticed in years. It wasn't grief, it was recognition. His father hadn't been cruel, he had been broken, and he had passed that silence down like a family heirloom. Days passed. David read one journal every night, always alone, always with the same soft light and quiet music playing on a loop from his phone. The words weren't dramatic, there were no grand revelations, but the honesty, the raw, unfinished thoughts, carried more weight than any inheritance ever could. I watched him grow, and I feared he would become me, so I left him nothing, hoping he would become himself. One entry described a dream. In the dream, he was laughing, at a dinner table, with people I didn't recognize. He looked free, and I stood in the doorway, watching, uninvited, but proud. David closed the book and stared at the ceiling. He had always thought of his father as distant, cold, strategic, but what if that was only half the truth? What if the silence had been its own language, one his father never learned to translate? One afternoon, David took the letters, the ones addressed to him, and drove to Lake Geneva. It had been their vacation spot when he was a child. He remembered sand between his toes, grilled cheese sandwiches, and his father, not in a suit but in jeans, trying to skip stones. He hadn't been back since he was 12. He sat by the water and opened one of the final letters. "You may think I failed you, and in many ways I did, but I never stopped watching, never stopped wondering what kind of man you would become if I simply let go." David folded the letter carefully, placed it in his jacket pocket, and stared at the water. He didn't cry this time. He smiled. Later that evening, back in his apartment, he He pulled out his laptop and wrote something for the first time in months. Not a resume, not a message, not a plan. A letter to the man I used to be. He wrote for hours, pouring out the words like water from a cracked vessel. All the pain, all the anger, all the moments he had swallowed instead of speaking. He wrote until the sun began to rise, and he fell asleep at his desk, a peaceful exhaustion blanketing his body. When he woke, he didn't reread it. He didn't need to. Some letters were never meant to be sent. Chicago winters were cruel, not because of the cold, but because of the silence that came with them. The kind that wrapped around you not like a blanket, but like a weight. David didn't mind it. He walked to work most days, coat zipped to the neck, gloves half torn. He passed people who didn't know his name, who didn't care where he came from. And somehow that anonymity felt more honest than the artificial respect he had once commanded as a Montgomery. He rented books from the local library, cooked his own meals, learned how to fix a leaky pipe. Small things, mundane things, but each one chipped away at something toxic that had been living in him since childhood. Entitlement, the invisible curse of the air. He thought about the version of himself who once believed that money would solve everything. That version used to walk into rooms expecting people to yield. That version never asked questions, only gave orders. That version feared one thing above all: failure. But failure, he had come to learn, was not the end. It was the beginning. Without money, without title, without legacy, he had to find out who David Montgomery actually was. Not the son of Charles Montgomery. Not the would-be CEO, just David. At the diner, Carla, the waitress who had once asked about his past, started saving him a seat during breaks. They talked more now. Not about deep things at first. Music, favorite meals, people watching. One day she asked him again, "Do you ever miss it? The wealth?" He sipped his coffee before answering. "Sometimes," he said, "not the money itself, but the illusion of certainty it gave me." She nodded. But that illusion, he added, came with a price. Meanwhile, the headlines about Richard, the man who had inherited the Montgomery fortune, were getting darker. Montgomery Holdings files for bankruptcy. Former executive under investigation. Private mansion put on market amid scandal. David didn't feel schadenfreude, just sadness. Richard had always been loyal, not to the family, but to the game. He had mastered the art of smiling at the right people, attending the right fundraisers, shaking hands with the devils who built empires on sand. And now it was all collapsing, exactly as his father had predicted. One night, David opened one of the final journals, the only one written entirely in red ink. It was different from the others, less structured, more frantic, more personal. "By the time you read this, you'll understand why I left you nothing. You think the money was power. It wasn't. It was poison. Every friend I had was paid. Every decision I made was to protect what I had built, even when it made me hate who I had become. And the worst part, I was going to give it all to you." David closed the journal slowly, exhaling a breath he didn't realize he was holding. There it was. The curse. Not a hex, not a mystical thing. Just a pattern. A father becoming his father. A son molded to repeat it. But the chain had been broken. By absence. By nothingness. That weekend, David took a long walk through the city. Snow fell in quiet flakes, coating everything in temporary purity. He stopped at a bookstore and bought a blank journal. That night he wrote, "I didn't lose an inheritance. I lost a cage, and in that loss I found space to breathe." He didn't know who would read it, but maybe one day someone would. Maybe his own child. If he ever had one. And if he did, they would never inherit the curse. It was a Thursday morning when David saw Richard again. Not in person, but on a screen in a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue. Muted television. Rolling news ticker. Former Montgomery Holdings CEO found dead in luxury apartment. Suspected overdose. David didn't move. He stared at the flickering image. A photo of Richard younger, smiling, flanked by politicians and celebrities. Then another, more recent. Hollow-eyed, pale, alone. The anchor's voice was inaudible, but the words on the screen said enough. No foul play suspected. No family present. Richard, the man who had inherited everything, had died the way David's father had feared. Consumed not by poverty but by the pressure of maintaining a fortune built on silence. That night, David walked for hours. Chicago's streets blurred into each other. His thoughts were heavy but calm. Not mournful, not exactly. Just sobered. He remembered Richard as a boy, a little older, always in the room, always watching. Not quite a brother, not quite a stranger. He had been groomed by Charles Montgomery in secret. David saw it now. While David was being criticized, Richard was being trained, not to lead, but to obey, to uphold, to protect the empire. And that obedience had killed him. Back home, David poured a glass of wine and pulled out one of his father's last letters, one he hadn't dared open yet. It was addressed not to David, but to Richard. He hesitated, then read, "Richard, I'm sorry. I used you. I used your loyalty to keep the walls from collapsing. I knew I wasn't leaving it to David, but I also knew you didn't want it either. You were the shield, and I made you believe that made you strong. But shields are meant to be broken, and I never told you how to walk away. Forgive me, if not now, then someday." No signature, just ink smudged near the bottom, as if written through tears. David sat back in his chair, stunned. He couldn't shake the image of Richard's apartment, luxurious, sterile, lifeless. How many dinners alone? How many nights with only silence and headlines for company? Wealth had insulated him, but it hadn't protected him. It had buried him in velvet. The next day, David called the estate's legal office. "I want to arrange something," he said, "for Richard." The woman on the phone hesitated. "There's no one else," she replied softly. "No family, no friends on file." "I know," he said, "that's why." He used his own savings to pay for a small memorial service. No press, no show, just a simple ceremony in a cemetery outside the city. Only 2 people attended, David and an older man who had once worked as Richard's driver. The sky was gray. David said nothing, just stood, because sometimes the only way to honor a fallen heir is to witness the silence he left behind. That night, David opened his journal again. He wrote, "He inherited everything and died with nothing. I inherited nothing and somehow found peace." He paused, then added, "Maybe this was the gift all along." 3 years had passed. David was now 36. He lived in a modest apartment above a bookstore. His life was simple, structured around small routines: morning walks, evening journaling, quiet meals, and conversations with people who saw him as nothing more than David. Not David Montgomery, heir to a dynasty, just a man, a human being. And yet, there was a thread that remained untied. The mansion. He hadn't seen it since Richard's death. Rumor had it the estate had been auctioned, but the buyer never completed the deal. Legal entanglements, frozen assets, abandoned interest. The house had stood still, like a mausoleum, a relic no one wanted to inherit anymore. One morning, David took a train to the outskirts, to the place where everything had started and ended. He didn't know what he was looking for. Closure, maybe, or simply acknowledgement. The estate gates were rusted now. Vines crept along the stone columns. The iron emblem of the Montgomery crest was bent as if time itself had grown tired of the weight it carried. David stepped through the gate. No alarms, no security, just wind and silence. The lawn was overgrown, the windows dusty and lifeless, the front door surprisingly unlocked. Inside, the air was colder than he remembered. Not from lack of heat, but from memory. Everything was still there. The portraits, the grand chandelier, the echo of footsteps, and the stillness that once screamed wealth now whispered loss. He walked the halls slowly. Each room unfolded like a chapter he had once tried to skip. The library, where the will had shattered his expectations. The dining hall, where conversations had always been transactional. The study, now stripped of its power, just a room of forgotten wood and books with cracked spines. But it was the second floor of the west wing that pulled him. He entered the master bedroom. Everything was just as it had been the day his father died, perfectly preserved, immaculate, untouched. He stepped inside and sat on the edge of the bed, the same place he had once avoided as a child. The room where silence was king. Now it was just a room. David looked around, and then he spoke. Not loudly, not dramatically, but softly. "I forgive you." He didn't expect a response, but he felt something shift. Not in the room, in himself. It wasn't peace. It was the permission to move on. Before leaving, he went downstairs one last time. In the cellar, the chest was still there. The journals, the memories, he didn't take them. They had served their purpose. Instead, he left something of his own, his journal. Inside, he had written, "To whoever finds this. This house was once a monument to power, but power has no memory. What you inherit is not in these walls. It's in the choices you make when no one's watching. My father gave me nothing, and in doing so, gave me the only thing I needed, a way out. He closed the journal, placed it gently inside the chest, and walked away. As he stepped out into the fading light of dusk, David didn't look back. Some places don't need to be visited twice, because once you see them clearly, they stop owning you. The sun was rising through the window of David's apartment. Soft golden light spilled over stacks of books, the edge of his desk, and a blank sheet of paper waiting to become something more. He had thought about this moment for a long time, not because he needed to write it, but because he had finally become the kind of man who could. He picked up his pen. "To my future son," he wrote, then paused. Not because he had a son, he didn't, not yet, maybe never. But the letter wasn't really for a specific person. It was for the future, for the possibility, for the kind of boy he once was, waiting for something to make him whole. You might grow up hearing my name, or maybe not. You might think you deserve something from me. Money, property, legacy. But if you're reading this, it's because I gave you none of those things. David leaned back, closed his eyes, took a breath, then continued. Not because I don't love you, but because I love you enough to give you freedom. I've learned that inheritance isn't about what you receive, it's about what you're free not to carry. My father gave me silence. I resented him for it. Then I realized it was the only thing that saved me. I hope you never need to be saved from me. He paused, then added, but if you do, I hope I'm brave enough to let go. He folded the letter slowly, slipped it into an envelope, wrote no name on it, just a small phrase on the outside. If you ever feel lost, start here. He placed it in the same wooden box that now held his father's final journal, the one he had taken back from the mansion. 2 generations, 2 stories, 2 endings rewritten. That evening, David walked to the lake, the same place he had once read his father's words. He stood quietly. The water reflected the sky in muted blue. No drama, no music, just a man alone with the version of himself that might have been. He whispered, "Thank you for leaving me nothing." And in that nothing he had found everything.